now more than ever, I think the mission of spaces like JWJI are absolutely invaluable, given the need to foster intelligent, informed, and critical dialogue around issues of race, inclusion, and difference in American society. And while I prepared my presentation long before the events of this past weekend, I would be remiss in not locating my comments this afternoon within a broader context of ongoing debates around race, patriotism, citizenship, and national belonging. One of the arguments driving this book, Citizen, Student, Soldier, is that we cannot understand the experiences and the motivations of young students of color and working class students, in particular Latino students, and the relationship to high school military programs like the Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps program, unless we take seriously the simultaneous mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion that military programs and military service offers Latino communities and communities of color. So from my analysis, the most recent events of Donald Trump and his scathing attacks on black athletes like Steph Curry and Colin Kaepernick, and others expressing their constitutional rights of freedom of speech and labeling them as unpatriotic, highlights the insidious ways that patriotism, national belonging, and militarism intersect with race and citizenship in our daily lives. And as I'll touch on briefly in my comments later on in my presentation, the fact that this controversy is happening around national sporting events like the NFL is not at all surprising. And in fact, I think it reveals a troubling kind of civilian-military divide in our country that demands patriotic performances, like the Pledge of Allegiance and singing the national anthem at sporting events that has become a ubiquitous feature of attending national sporting events. And to have these national performances simultaneous with a moment in which, and kind of these different kind of moments of paying homage and respect to enlisted military personnel, that this happens at the same moment in which less than 1% of the American public serves in the US military. So with that being said, I want to affirm the need for research that locates race and citizenship and militarism within these discussions of social inequality and social transformation. And that's the hope that I have with my book. So my book, Citizen, Student, Soldier, provides an ethnographic lens for exploring the motivations and experiences and aspirations of Latino youth who participate in one JROTC unit in Lorain, Ohio, which is about 35 miles west of Cleveland. So for those of you who need to locate Ohio and Lorain, and also know for me to really embrace Steph Curry as someone who comes from the land of the Cavs is really important. I want to also highlight. So Lorain, Ohio is just west of Cleveland. And it's a city that's also referred to as the international city, and takes a great deal of pride in this label, and it reflects the incredibly diverse range of immigrants and migrants to the city beginning in the late 19th century. And part of that migration history includes the migration of Puerto Rican residents in the 1940s, largely beginning as recruited laborers as part of Puerto Rico's industrialization campaign on the island, and different kinds of efforts to manage Puerto Rican migration to the United States and to cities specifically like New York, Chicago, Cleveland, and Philadelphia and Lorain, Ohio. So at that time, companies and industrial companies like the National Tube Company was one of many employers that actively recruited Puerto Rican workers at this time. And this is the beginning of one of the oldest and most vibrant Puerto Rican communities in the United States. And again, I think very similar to a place like Chicago, you have this growth and the sustained kind of development of a Puerto Rican migration alongside Mexican migrant and migrant communities in Northeast Ohio that I think is very different than what we see in places like New York or Chicago, where you have, either Chicanos or Puerto Ricans kind of dominating, kind of Latino identity on the coast. And so Puerto Rico, Lorain, Cleveland are very special in that regard, that you have Mexican and Puerto Rican and pan-ethnic, pan-Latino populations coexisting for a very, very long time. And so part of this, part of why this is important is that as a result of this sustained and long and historical migration is that Puerto Ricans have established important businesses as well as community-based organizations that continue to operate and play a very important role in the Latino community. And as Dr. Gillespie mentioned, my latest project is really looking at the role that Puerto Ricans are playing in ongoing sanctuary movements and efforts in Northeast Ohio as a way to create and to support kind of pan-ethnic solidarity and unity. So this is kind of a background to the project and the focus on JROTC in Lorraine. But before I begin, I wanted to ask all of you a question and to ask how many of you have heard or have participated in some kind of form of military program like JROTC. Okay, so not that many. So, and I ask that because it's always surprising, like how many people don't know about JROTC, and it's a program that's been in existence for over 100 years in American public schools, and people's knowledge and experiences with JROTC are quite varied and uneven. And so one of the things that is really important for you to know is that JROTC is a high school-based military program that was established in 1916, and its stated goal and mission is to motivate young people to be better citizens. And from its humble beginnings in 1916 as a not-so-popular program in American public schools, there's a lot of controversy around JROTC and whether or not this should be a program that should merit the kind of ideological as well as financial investment from the federal government. And so it was very, very small. JROTC now has more than 500,000 students and approximately 3,400 units with thousands of retired military personnel serving as its instructors. And so we can see some examples of this. In short, JROTC has become a familiar feature in American public schools. And not only has it become a familiar feature in American public schools, but Latino youth, in particular, Latinas, increasingly swell the ranks of JROTC programs, which reflects, I think, a great deal of the kind of educational segregation that we see in American public schools. But there's also something else going on that I'll explore in my talk today. I first became interested in studying the experiences of Latino youth in JROTC while completing my field work for my first book that focuses on the experiences of low-income and working-class Puerto Rican migrants in Chicago in the late 1990s. And realizing as a result of that work that something that was ubiquitous but had been completely naturalized to me, which was seeing young people, young high school students wearing a cadet uniform, walking into people's homes and seeing framed photographs of enlisted military personnel or young people who were in JROTC. These were things that I saw all the time, and thankfully I documented in my field notes. But I didn't, it wasn't something that I was really interested or wasn't really paying attention to because I had a different focus for that first project. That these ubiquitous images I had sort of taken for granted and hadn't really considered what they had to say about people's dreams and aspirations and pathways to social and economic mobility that are familiar to many working class and middle class Latino families. For many working class communities, including Latinos, military service has long been tied to dreams of aspirations for a better future. For Latinos in particular, military service is often a venerated part of our personal and family histories. We often take a great deal of pride in the individual people we know, family members perhaps, who have honorably served in the US military. And we can count and draw attention to the nationally specific examples of military service. And so, military service, as many scholars in Latino studies and African American studies and Native American studies have shown, is an important site of struggle to lay claim to full citizenship rights, especially in moments of historical moments when powerful mechanisms of exclusion operate. And so, for example, I'm thinking about the work of the Chicana historian Lorena Oropesa, for example, who looks at the development of the GI Forum that made demands for full citizenship rights for Mexicanos in Texas and in the US South in a moment of incredible hostility to Mexicans and Mexican Americans and Jim Crow-style segregation and exclusion in the 1950s. And another example of, historically of ethnically specific kind of pride around the U.S. military for Puerto Ricans is the celebration of the Borinqueneers, who recently were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2014 by President Obama. And so the Congressional Gold Medal is awarded to persons who have performed an achievement that has an impact on American history and culture that is likely to be recognized as a major achievement in the recipient's field long after the achievement. And so in this case, the Borinqueneers were the longest and longest standing and only active duty segregated Latino military unit in U.S. history. And here I'm showing an example of a special ceremony that took place in Lorraine, where the gold medal was brought by the Smithsonian Institute to honor veterans who had served in the Borinqueneers, years before. And it was this really powerful and very emotional ceremony to celebrate this history. And rather than being exceptional, this celebration of the Borinqueneers is part of a broader embrace of the U.S. military and military service by residents in Lorraine, right? And so, one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation is Lorraine is known as the international city, but it's also recently been renamed the Purple Heart City to recognize the proud kind of and the active role that veterans play in the city. And so I think for Puerto Rican and Latino enlisted military personnel and retired military personnel to locate themselves within that history has been really, really significant. Puerto Rican veterans and participants in JROTC play an important role, both in the international and the Purple Heart City. And what these processes highlight is not only the patriotism of different groups, but also the powerful and ubiquitous narratives of how the military has changed lives for the better and provided opportunities and opened doors that were otherwise unavailable to many working class Latinos, and based on mechanisms of exclusion based on race and citizenship and language, for example. For many Latinos, this reality of social and economic mobility is bound up with powerful narratives of the ways that Latino and Hispanic cultures and values are seen as commensurate with those of the U.S. military. And this is one of these comparisons that when you read some of these speeches, say for Hispanic Heritage Month, you often have enlisted or retired military personnel extolling the incredibly proud histories of Latino military service and make these references and say it's the values of the U.S. military are exactly the same values of Hispanic culture, of family, of pride, of respect, and of honor. And so what my book does is it wants to recognize the importance of this history and the relationships between Latinos and the U.S. military that are very, very complicated, and to really kind of locate the experiences of these young people who are participating in high school military programs and to understand how they make these decisions about this, even while they can have different kinds of critiques of the U.S. military. So what I'm interested in understanding is how they make these decisions, and also to locate it within a very, very polarized debate about JROTC. And so one of the things that became very clear to me when I first started doing this research more than 10 years ago was that the debate around JROTC is extremely polarized. On the one hand, you have proponents of the program who say this is exactly the kind of program that we should be investing federal money in because it helps allegedly at-risk youth. It helps to provide them with a positive alternative to allegedly other kinds of alternatives they might have. So for example, retired General Colin Powell, for example, was one of the key people who helped to expand JROTC in 1992 following the Los Angeles uprising. And his embrace of JROTC as a powerful alternative for many young people who might otherwise choose to be involved with gangs was one of the reasons why he supported JROTC's expansion. In his memoir, My American Journey, he writes, quote, "Inner city kids, many from broken homes, found stability and role models in JROTC. They got a taste of discipline and work ethic, and they experienced pride of membership in something healthier than a gang," unquote. So that's kind of one side of the of this polarized debate. Critics of JROTC, on the other hand, claim that despite claims to the contrary that the program is a recruiting tool, and they say that it specifically targets poor and working class youth, and that these students in particular are tracked into military programs rather than college preparation. And so you have, on the other hand, opponents to the program who don't see any value in the program at all, and who see it as a recruiting tool for the U.S. military. So within this extremely polarized debate, I argue that ethnography offers a unique opportunity to understand how Latino youth and their families make decisions regarding their participation in JROTC, their attitudes about the US military, and their futures. So the focus of my book is the experiences of these young people in one JROTC unit in Lorraine. And rather than definitively claim whether or not JROTC is either a good or bad program, the goal of my book has been to convey the complex motivations and experiences and aspirations of young people who participate in JROTC. And so I do this by focusing on 4 areas of young people's lives. I focused on their families' military histories, because a lot of these young people have family members who are either currently enlisted in the military or who have these long, proud histories of military service. And so I explore kind of how does that shape their experiences and their understanding the decisions to participate in JROTC. I also look at how young people discuss their reasons for joining JROTC, including how the young people themselves describe how participating in the program provided them with discipline. It taught them ways to stand out and to be the kind of people and the kind of leaders that they hope to be in the future. I also explore the ways that both JROTC as a program markets itself as a leadership program. It also likes to tout itself as the largest federally funded youth leadership program in the nation, and how people use it as a way to develop important social capital that is really critical to them. And finally, I explore how young people develop a sense about themselves as citizens as a result of their involvement in JROTC. And in all of these areas, I argue that it's absolutely important to understand this in order to understand the material and ideological context in which Latino communities reside, and also to explain why it is that young people embrace JROTC as well as the broader public support for the program. And this is also something that's really important that I found in my research, that it's not just the school and the administrators and the students themselves who are involved in the program, but its success relies on the embrace by the broader public. So local veterans groups, different kinds of elected officials are very, very much in support of and provide different kinds of involvement and support of people who are in JROTC. In this context, military service and participation becomes a really appealing option for many working class Latino youth. And while the students I worked with in Lorraine were very clear about the ways that their family's military service was often inspired their decision to join JROTC, they often told very sobering stories about how this was one of the only and most visible options available to them. And this, I argue, is no accident. Beginning in the late 1990s, the US military has devoted significant resources to military recruitment, and most specifically the recruitment of Latinos to increase its ranks. According to the US Army Recruiting Command, Latinos were projected to constitute 25% of the US population by 2025. And in order to capitalize on this expected growth, recruiters were urged to focus their efforts on recruiting in areas like with high Latino populations, such as Los Angeles and San Antonio, that also were areas with weaker labor markets, and so would be fertile ground for recruitment efforts. The Department of Defense has also enlisted the research efforts of organizations to identify trends conducive to successfully recruiting Latinos into including their youth, their positive attitudes towards the military compared to African American and white youth, and their higher, quote unquote, active duty propensity compared to non-Hispanic youth. And so all this research has demonstrated that, compared to African American and white youth, that Latinos not only enlist in the US military, but they also re-enlist at higher rates than African Americans and white youth. These trends are especially true in the US Marine Corps, and so if there's anyone interested in doing research in the military and interested in Latino studies, this is one fertile ground for research, where Latino recruits increasingly swell the ranks and are more likely than recruits of other races and ethnicities to complete boot camp and their first term of service. And unlike other branches of the military where Latinos are slightly underrepresented, Latinos are overrepresented in the Marine Corps. And although Latinos account for less than 10% of active duty forces, historians like Harry Frankie Rivera have noted that Puerto Rican youth are currently enlisting in the military at higher rates than previous decades, and, quote, Puerto Ricans are almost twice as likely to be in the military as the general population, unquote. For many migrants and immigrants, enlisting in the military after 9/11 was appealing precisely because it provided an avenue for expediting one's citizenship status, with President Bush's issued Executive Order 13269 on July 3rd, 2002, granting all non-citizen soldiers serving in the War on Terror the ability to do so. For others, the military's appeal lies in its promise of economically secure futures, access to loans to pay for higher education, and the more elusive rewards of prestige and social status. Latinos who enlist in the military also are part of a rich tradition of proud military service that has been also an important catalyst for advancing social justice movements that in some instances have ultimately led to important critiques of the US military, and there are many Latino studies scholars and African American studies scholars have documented this. Many military leaders have emphasized that the ways that military values and culture resonate with those of Latino families. And so, for example, Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez, for example, noted, quote, "When I became a soldier, the ethics and the value system of the military profession fit almost perfectly with my own Hispanic heritage. It made it very easy for me to adapt to the military value system," unquote. The love of one's family and of nation and of self-sacrifice and loyalty are allegedly the shared values binding Hispanic heritage and the military. Thus, when military leaders and politicians and civic organizations appeal to Hispanic values and traditions as precisely the same values that characterize the US military, the most respected American institution today, it is not surprising that many would feel proud and encourage such positive comparisons, especially given the anti-immigrant and negative political social climate in which many Latino families live today. Indeed, as anthropologist Arlene Davila observes, quote, "These favorable representations of Latino communality, of hard work and family not only demonstrate that Latinos are not a social liability, but in fact, they celebrate these contributions and their embrace of values that make them, quote, more American than the Americans," unquote. My research among JROTC cadets at one high school in Lorraine supports these findings and exemplifies why many young Latinos and Latinas turn to JROTC programs. Doing so not only provides them the possibility of respectability, but it also enables them to access social capital, very precious social capital, otherwise unavailable to them. This indeed is a familiar strategy employed by other marginalized youth seeking to be recognized and acknowledged for the good that they and their families contribute. And many scholars, like the sociologist Victor Rios, have noted, young people utilize the resources available to them to show the system that they are worthy of being treated as young people with promise, as potentially good students, and as hardworking, honest employees. Participation in JROTC is one way youth affirm that they are worthy, and they're worthy of the state's investment in them, and they're constantly reminded that as JROTC cadets that the government is investing in them, and that they're worthy of that investment, and as well as that they're worthy of the high regard and the hope and the resources veterans groups, teachers, parents, and others have placed in them. In this way, youth enact a vision of citizenship that emphasizes their self-reliance and responsibility and self-discipline, which resonate deeply with neoliberal ideas about citizenship. Yet in doing so, these young people also facilitate the creation of new models of citizenship and belonging rooted in a commitment to community uplift that challenge an emphasis on independence and productivity. And this is something that I explore extensively in my book as well. If, as many writers have noted, that the military is often embraced as a corrective measure for the alleged deficient behavior of deviant youth, The cadets that I worked with in Lorraine were very conscious and demonstrated the ways that their citizenship education has served to correct kind of narrow definitions of national membership. And so there were all these ways that they were very aware of the ways that they and their families are stigmatized in public discourse, as poor migrants and Latino migrants. And they would have these kinds of reflections that expanded this notion of citizenship and kind of wanted to acknowledge the ways that their families weren't deficient and in fact were vital and critical contributors to society. So in doing so, these young people offer more expansive understandings about citizenship and belonging that demand that their families and communities be valued for their humanity and inherent self-worth. In my research, I found a number of creative ways that young people have been able to harness the resources of JROTC to develop the skills and networks and insights critical for them to successfully navigate their schooling, their obligations to their families and friends, and their aspirations for the future. In the book, I discuss how young people relied on recommendations from JROTC commanders to get jobs, to get letters of recommendation for college and employment. And these are often things that are very hard to do when you're at a large public school where you have, it's very hard to get the kind of support and guidance from career counselors, for example. I document the ways that their connections with veterans organizations in the area raised their profile in a positive way into communities, in their communities, and often translated into different kinds of employment as well. It provided them with a sense of purpose and immense social standing. And it also provided them, in their own words, they talked about the skills such as discipline and leadership and organizational skills that they sought and they knew were valuable for their success beyond high school. Given the different ways that JROTC youth have been able to harness these resources in these positive ways, therefore, the question still remains. Is it reasonable to support continued investment in JROTC, particularly in a moment of federal disinvestment, dispossession, and privatization in American public education? While in my book, I explore the many benefits young people derive from their participation in JROTC, in the conclusion of my book, I argue that we should be wary of such a proposition and propose that we need to consider this question within a broader landscape of militarization and militarism in our daily lives. And this is a landscape of militarism and militarization that is new, insidious, and perhaps one of our nation's most greatest challenges. And I am not alone in these concerns. In his book, Breach of Trust, How Americans Failed Their Soldiers and Their Country, historian Andrew Basovich raises concerns about the way war has become a normalized feature of our daily lives and the widening gap between the US military and the civilian population. He argues that while the American public make statements honoring and thanking those who serve, we allow soldiers to be sent to war without having to shoulder the burdens of war ourselves. He further argues that our failure to uphold the tradition of the citizen soldier has allowed for corruption, unfettered wars, and a tendency to seek military solutions rather than political ones. According to Basovich, we have allowed our military leaders to devise and promote, quote, a model of the warrior professional as citizen soldier's replacement, unquote. And we have made militarized globalization the cornerstone of our foreign policy. And all of these features, I cannot overemphasize how we have been seeing this played out in the last week in particular. This, he argues, has been to our detriment, and we continue to do so at our peril. The solution, he insists, is to restore a sense of collective service and sacrifice that would oblige the American public to contribute more than what he refers to as symbolic solidarity and vacuous proclamations to support our troops. And he is actually incredibly scathing about kind of the ways that sporting events become these public spectacles and performance of the symbolic patriotism and solidarity. And he writes, quote, reinstate a military system that mandates shared sacrifice, people's war, and you'll either have fewer wars or the means to create a larger army, unquote. Although Basovich clearly believes that conscription of all able-bodied Americans is one way to address this military-civilian divide, he also advances the notion of a program of national service in which military service would be one option among many, including the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps and other opportunities to serve those in need. Quote, Some national service personnel might carry assault rifles. Others would empty bedpans or pass out bed linens. But ultimately, such a program would restore our sense of collective duty, sacrifice, and obligation, and would make war less frequent and strengthen our nation. JROTC expansion, beginning in the 1990s, I argue, needs to be analyzed within this context of new American militarism. Again, Andrew Bacevich, in his 2005 book, The New American Militarism, he raises his own concerns around militarism in the following way. Quote, Americans have fallen prey to militarism, manifesting itself in the following characteristics: a romanticized view of soldiers, a tendency to see military power as the truest measure of our national greatness, and an outsized expectation regarding the efficacy of force. To a degree without precedent in American history, Americans have come to define the nation's strength and well-being in terms of military preparedness, military action, and the fostering of and nostalgia for military ideals, unquote. Locating the proliferation of JROTC programs within debates about the new American militarism allows us to see the challenges and crises in American public education, for example, and exemplifies the normalization of applying military solutions to non-military problems. JROTC is almost always promoted as one way to address behavioral challenges among students with its promise to foster, quote, a more constructive and disciplined learning environment, unquote, that appeals to school administrators, community members, and policy members alike. This was certainly an explicit and key factor in JROTC's pivotal expansion in 1992 after the Los Angeles riots, when General Colin Powell, among others, identified JROTC as a way to instill discipline, order, and responsibility in impoverished youth of color. The original intent behind JROTC in the early 20th century, ironically, was also a rehabilitative one, designed to use military discipline to address alleged deficiencies in working class and immigrant youth. If you'll recall, the early 20th century is also this incredible moment of high immigration, and there were lots of concerns about Americanizing those new immigrants, and JROTC was seen as one mechanism to do so. And while these are values embraced by a broader public, we need to acknowledge the ways that military programs serve as mechanisms of social reproduction, and how they can also exacerbate different kinds of social inequalities by hardening hierarchies based on class, race, region, immigration status, gender, and sexuality. So just as Andrew Bacevich cautions us to resist the nostalgia, praise, and affection that's often showered among troops, so too I think we should be circumspect about the enthusiasm and delight many adults enjoy when they see young people wearing the cadet uniform. And this is actually something that the students I worked with often talked about, is when they would wear the cadet uniform, they would talk about how differently they were treated when they were in the grocery store or in the mall or walking down the street, where suddenly people would thank them for their service, because they would mistake them for being enlisted military personnel. And for these young people, it was bewildering, because they're like, people don't pay attention to me when or they cross the street when they see me usually, but suddenly when I'm wearing this uniform, it means that I'm treated with the kind of status and high regard that is very unfamiliar to them. But again, this kind of way of embracing and being very kind of enthusiastic about the military is something also that Bacevich wants to caution us against, kind of in the broader political discourse. So some of Bacevich's most scathing critiques are reserved for political commentators like New York Times columnist David Brooks, who, according to Bacevich, exacerbate the military-civilian divide by romanticizing soldiers as, quote, virtuous, idealist, and altruist, unquote, and civilians, on the other hand, as, quote, selfish, immoral, and without virtue, unquote. Such antinomies are never useful and obscure the more insidious ways that ascribing virtue and nobility to some absolves the broader public from ever asking how open-ended wars became normalized and why less than 1% of the American population shoulders this burden. This kind of romanticism also characterizes some of the public's enthusiastic response to teenagers in uniform. And so while the students were kind of uncomfortable when this would happen, they would also talk about how that made them feel very proud. And this is not surprising given media images that portray young Latinos as dangerous, unruly, delinquent, and I think in the current political discourse, a range of different characterizations that are far from the reality. But it raises an important question about why is JROTC one of the few ways that working class youth of color are publicly recognized and valued as members of our society? As I presented my research over the past decade, I'm often asked that given our current neoliberal moment in which the state increasingly privatizes its duties and obligation and leaves them to be met by corporate interests, isn't JROTC exactly the kind of federal involvement we should support and encourage? A targeted program to support the needs of low-income families and communities of color? Although I agree that federally funded programs designed to meet the specific needs of low-income youth of color are needed, we also need to ask which kinds of programs are being developed, why they're being proposed at different historical moments, and whose interests they serve. These concerns are certainly some of the ones that animate anti-militarization activists who have organized and sometimes succeeded in challenging the proliferation in JROTC programs. And so you can see, especially in places like Los Angeles and San Diego, how they have kind of anti-militarist activists have worked with Latino community activists and organizations to challenge the proliferation of JROTC in their high schools. But also, at a moment in which Latinas and Latinos are the youngest and the fastest growing demographic, we need to be particularly concerned with the ways that the educational crisis in American public schools, the increasing cost of higher education, and Latinos' lower college completion rates, how all of these things converge with the proliferation of military schooling, weak labor markets, and our continued reliance on the all-volunteer force military to ensure that a small and select group of underprivileged youth remain a key source for replenishing the ranks of the US military. Such a position is neither radical nor cynical, and indeed, it is one that unites the political left and the political right, maybe one of the only things that unites the political left and the political right now, with activists, anarchists, and military leaders asking the same question. Why does it appear that only poor kids are the ones willing to have skin in the game? Although that it is true that patriotism, the love of one's country, and a sense of duty truly inspire some to serve in the US military, it's also the case that one's material conditions inform the decisions that these people make. As the anthropologist David Graeber argues, he argues that privileged youth are not unlike poor ones in their desires to do good in the world. What distinguishes the former is their ability to do so without having to worry about money. Poor and working class kids don't have that luxury, and military service offers the possibility of doing something they can be proud of while also ensuring their economic security. In Graeber's attempt to explain to largely white, middle-class, peace, and counter-recruitment activists why working class youth join the military, he reminds them that both groups are inspired by similar ideals. Quote, they want to escape the world of tedious work and meaningless consumerism, to live a life of adventure and camaraderie in which they believe they are doing something genuinely noble. They join the army because they want to be like you, unquote. Like the military, JROTC works precisely because it enjoys federal investment and community support and offers young people an opportunity to be part of something that is meaningful, noble, and something greater than themselves. And although other high school organizations can also do this, a lot of these young people are involved in Key Club and different kinds, in the band and theater and different kinds of community-based work, those programs don't enjoy the status and prestige and the robust social networks or resources that JROTC's military affiliation provides. In a moment in which Latino youth and their families are faced with simultaneous experiences of inclusion and exclusion to full citizenship rights, they increasingly rely on military programs to provide them with the resources, social status, and social capital they seek in order to succeed. These are reasonable strategies, although they are reasonable strategies among a shrinking number of opportunities for all those who seek better life for themselves, their families, and their communities. For many working class youth, reasonableness and pragmatism are familiar responses to uncertain economic and economic futures and moments of intense racialization and nativist projects that define them as outside the nation. But I would argue that also dreaming and aspiring for something greater than themselves and their family also characterize these families. And perhaps, this is one of the reasons why so many books, including novels, autobiographies, and scholarly works documenting the myriad experiences of Latino life as well as one of the most vibrant and visible social movements, the Dreamers, involving Latino youth today, why they all allude to the power of dreams to animate, inspire, and transform. So in conclusion, throughout the course of my research and writing about JROTC, my intention has been to listen and to understand the dreams and aspirations of those whose options seem so constrained and foreclosed by forces beyond their control. What their stories demonstrate, however, and they do so powerfully, are not only the pragmatic responses to adverse social and economic conditions, but also their creative strategies to broaden concepts such as citizenship, duty, and obligation, to encompass the mundane activities that they and their families are involved in that are essential in sustaining their aspirations and their dreams for the future. Their experiences also raise critical questions about our collective desires and hopes as a nation. What kinds of economic and social policies can we develop to expand opportunity for all young people? How do we create educational programs that engender meaningful civic engagement that do not rest solely on the prestige and high regard of the US military? And how do we advocate for more inclusive notions of citizenship and belonging that do not require proving one's worth and value to the nation? How we answer those questions has the potential to either affirm or deny the dreams of so many who believe, work, and organize collectively for better futures for themselves and for us all. So, thank you.